Okay, guys, this is Mr. Cannon here, and this is Lesson 6 in Government. Today we're going to be talking about the Congress. Congress is the head of our legislative branch. We've already gone over that. And as head of the legislative branch, that means that it is responsible for making the laws that affect all of us in the United States. Now, we're talking about at the federal level or the national level. You remember federalism is you've got federal, state, and local governments. Well, we're talking about the federal government, and the head of the lawmaking part of our federal government is called the Congress. So we're going to be looking at that today, and as we move forward, certainly, hopefully, you'll understand how Congress operates and works. All right, we've got two houses of Congress. As part of the Great Compromise was the compromise that gave the smaller states one part of Congress so that representation was equal for everybody. The other part of the compromise was the House of Representatives, which was the house that's based on population. If you have more people in your state, you get more representatives. So we have these two houses of Congress. It takes both of these houses to make laws. So if a law passes, it has to go both through the House and the Senate. Now, each of these bodies has specific powers or specific things that they can do that the other one can't do, and we'll look at those here in a minute. But overall, what you need to know is that our Congress is made up of two houses. The Senate is called the upper house because it's not as close to the people as the House of Representatives is. It talks more, it debates more. I use that word deliberates. That means it thinks through things at a slower pace. And because of that, it generally takes more time to pass a bill through the Senate than it does the House. Now, that's not always the case, but that's mainly the case. You have fewer senators. You only have 100 of them, 2 from each state. But they take a lot of time in going through a bill, discussing it, giving everybody an opportunity to speak on it before they move forward and either pass it or reject it. The other house is called the House of Representatives. It's considered the lower house because it is closer to the people. You have, for instance, in South Carolina, every state has 2 senators. So we only have 2 senators that represent our entire state, and they have to answer to our entire state. But in the House of Representatives, South Carolina has 7 members, and they're divided into districts. In my district, here in the middle part of the state, a guy named Joe Wilson, Congressman Joe Wilson, is my member of the House of Representatives. He answers to me more directly than, say, our 2 senators, Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott, do, because they have to answer to more of the people. He represents, Congressman Wilson represents less people. There are 7 of these people all throughout the state. Many of you aren't in the same district I am. Some of you may be, but if you live on the coast, you have a different representative. If you live up in Greenville or Spartanburg, you have a different representative. Down in Charleston, a different one, and so on and so forth. So these members of the House tend to be closer to the people. They also tend to pass laws quicker and with less debate. So things move quicker through the House of Representatives. Let's look closer at the Senate. The Senate is made up of 100 members, 2 from each state. So it doesn't matter how many people you have in your state, you have 2 senators. So Wyoming, who has very few people living in their state, Wyoming has 2 senators. California, who has a lot of people living in their state, they have 2 senators. So when you add them all up, 50 times 2 is 100, so there are 100 members of the Senate. Senators serve longer terms than House members do. Senators serve 6-year terms. So when they get elected, they serve for 6 years before they are up for re-election. A third of them are elected every cycle. So you'll have around 33 to 34 who are elected every 2 years. Now, there's a 6-year term, but it rotates. So, for instance, in the 2020 election coming up, 33 senators will be up for re-election or for election to begin with. And then in 2022, the second third will be up again. And then in 2024, the last third will be up again. The qualifications to be in the Senate are you got to be at least 30 years old. You must be a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years. And you must live in the state you represent. Now that when we say live in the state, a lot of these senators live both in Washington, D.C., and they have a residence in South Carolina, or in the state they represent. So you have to have at least a residency in your state that you represent. Senators used to be appointed by state legislatures. So that's another reason they weren't as close to the people, because they didn't really answer to the people. They answered to the state legislatures. For instance, in South Carolina, our state house would appoint our 2 senators. But that's not the way it's done today. The 17th Amendment changed that. So because of the 17th Amendment, now senators are elected directly by the people. But for the first 100+ years of our history, that wasn't the case. Senators weren't elected by the people. They were appointed by the legislatures. I am glad they answer to us now and are elected by us, because that means if I have a problem with them, they have to listen. Whereas before, they may just say, I don't really care what you think because you don't elect me anyway. In the House of Representatives, you can see it's a much larger chamber. There are 435 people in the House of Representatives. It's based on population. So to give you an example, we have 7 members in South Carolina of the House of Representatives, because we're a relatively small state. Wyoming only has 1 because they're a really small population-wise state. But California has 53. California has the most. They have 53 members of the House in California. We have 7. Wyoming has 1. House members serve 2-year terms, so they are elected every 2 years, and the whole House is up for re-election every single cycle. So in 2020, all 435 members of the House will be up for election. The qualifications for the House are that you must be at least 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, at least 7 years, and you must live in the district you represent. Again, you may have a double residency or a triple residency. You could live in Washington, you could live in another state, but you got to have a residence in the district you actually represent. So Joe Wilson, who represents my district, he has a house in this district. Because House members are elected by district, in other words, they don't represent an entire state, they represent a district within the state, districts have to be drawn. And one of the practices that's been around for a long time by political parties to try to stay in power is called gerrymandering. This practice is where they draw district lines that benefit them the most. So for instance, in South Carolina, they may draw out of the 7 districts, if Republicans are in charge, we're going to pretend, well, that's actually true, they are in charge in South Carolina, but it doesn't matter which party it is. Whoever's in charge of that state will generally try to divide up those districts and draw them in such a way that they maximize their voters. So you would have, in South Carolina, they draw it in such a way that most of the Democratic people in South Carolina are concentrated or put in one district. That way, they're definitely going to lose that district, the Republicans are, but they're going to have a good chance to win the other 6. So they try to get as many Democrats in that one district. In fact, it's I think it's District 6 that Jim Clyburn represents. Jim Clyburn is a Democrat. But the other, and by the way, a Democrat is almost guaranteed to win that district because it has so many Democrats living in it. But because they concentrate all the Democrats in that district, the other districts, they're drawn weirdly, the lines are drawn weirdly to try to make it where Republicans can win the other districts. In states where Democrats dominate, the same thing happens. Democrats draw their lines to try to maximize their votes. So they're going to give up some of the districts in order to win more districts. That's the way it works. Gerrymandering is actually named because the guy who won a district, I think it was in Maryland, I believe it's Maryland, his name was Jerry, and the district looked like a salamander. So instead of calling it a salamander, they called it a gerrymander because he won in that weird-looking salamander-shaped district. And that term stuck, and it became known as gerrymandering. And that's what both parties do that today. There was a recent Supreme Court decision where the court was asked to overturn the practice of gerrymandering, and they refused to do so. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court said that it's up to Congress how to draw district lines, and if they want to draw them weird, they're welcome to do so. So just to repeat, gerrymandering is the practice of drawing weird-shaped lines in districts, weird looking districts, so that one party can get more power. And if the Democrats are in charge of their state, they'll draw weird looking lines to help them. When the Republicans are in power in a certain state, they draw weird lines to help them. Both parties do this. You can see some of these weird districts out of Maryland, and this is just one example. We could go to any state and do this, but you can see how some of these districts are way weird looking. They cross and zigzag and do all kind of crazy things. And the purpose, of course, is to make sure that the party, whoever's drawing the districts, gets more power. A huge advantage in getting reelected over and over again is called the incumbency advantage. Now, an incumbent is someone who is already in office. So they're not a challenger. They're not someone who's trying to get in office. They're somebody who's already in office. And the chances of winning an election after you're already in office are really high. People who get elected tend to get re-elected, and there's a reason for this. It's called the incumbency advantage. One of the biggest advantages that incumbents have is name ID. We know their names because they've been in the news. If, like Joe Wilson, I named him. Joe Wilson is in the news quite often because he represents my district here in South Carolina. So I recognize his name. So if I'm a voter who doesn't pay that close attention and I go to the voting booth and I look at two names on a ballot, one of them is Joe Wilson, the other is another guy or another lady, I recognize Joe Wilson's name, so I'm going to vote for him. Now, that doesn't always happen, but that is a huge advantage because a lot of people do vote based on name ID, the fact that they know your name. There's also the advantage of money. It's much easier to raise money when you're already in office than it is if you're a challenger. Companies and PACs and lobbyists would more likely give money to somebody who's already in office than they will somebody who's trying to get in office. You have the ability to use free media. I just told you about Joe Wilson. His name is in the news. He doesn't have to pay for that. His name is in the news because of stuff he does as a congressman. The same thing's true with our senators. Their names are in the news. So because incumbents' names are in the news, they get to use that free media to build up their name ID, which allows them to get reelected over and over and over. And that's why some people have called for what's called term limits. And you can see there in the political cartoon, people call for term limits because people keep getting elected over and over and over. And we complain about Congress. We say, man, I wish Congress would change. And yet we keep electing the same people to Congress all the time. So Congress has different jobs. You know, its primary job is to make laws. That's what it does. It makes laws. But there are other jobs it does too. Most jobs of Congress require both houses to complete. There are a few, however, that only the House or only the Senate can do. So, for instance, only the House can impeach a president. To impeach means to bring charges against. Only the House of Representatives can actually do that. Now, only the Senate can actually try an impeachment case. So if the House impeaches a president, it's the Senate who then has a trial over that case and decides whether the president is guilty or not guilty. Only the House can start spending bills. Only the House can elect the president in case of a tie in the Electoral College. That's only happened once, but it could happen. If there's a tie, it would go to the House of Representatives. Only the Senate can approve treaties. So if the president wants to sign a treaty, he has to get approval from the Senate. Only the Senate can give consent on judges. So if the president puts a judge up to be appointed, the Senate has to either give consent or not give consent on that. And you can see there in the chart, it gives some of the exclusive powers of each, things only the House can do and things only the Senate can do. And then it gives things that are both. Concurrent is meaning that both do these things. So you can look at that chart and see some of the different things there.